Validation. There are several ways that you can perform validation. So here we are going to talk about some of those. Choice number one, you can actually call the validator. You can actually set the validator object on what is called the binder. We haven't talked about the binder yet. Okay, and we're gonna actually talk about the data binding later on. So that's one way of doing it. I'm gonna actually talk about these things in a bit more detail in the following slide. I just want to give you a big picture in terms of what choices you have. Okay, so you can associate a validator to a data binder. So data binder will call this validator. That's one option. Okay. And in this case, you can allow you to configure validator instance per controller class. Choice number two is that you can explicitly call validate method in yourself. Okay, so this is a bit more manual, I would say. It allows you to call a validator method at the location you want, so that could be an advantage. Third option is calling set validator with a validator object on the global web binding initializer. In this case, it will be applied to all controllers. So the first option of this first option and second options are applying to only to controllers that you're dealing with. Okay, but third option will be applied to all controllers. So let's take a look at each of these choices. So this is choice number one. So what you can do is you can actually use init binder annotation, and so when you are using init binder annotation on a method, okay, you are basically initializing data binder. Okay, so what you get is what is called the web data binder, and then basically on that binder you can set the validator. So suppose you have a full validator object, which shows in the bottom part of the slide. So this full validator implements validator interface, and this validator interface has one single method called the validate, and it receives the target object and errors object. So here you can provide some validation logic. So we might actually call some method or some logic. So we're going to call validate failed method or whatever. Okay, and if it returns true, that means validation failed. Then we are going to call reject value method of errors with a field name and error code. So this is where we are basically adding we could actually add all the validation errors into these errors, the arrays. Okay, and that could be inspected later on. Okay, so basically you create this validator object and then call set validator method, and then when data binding happens, this validator will be invoked. Okay, so that is option number one. Option number two is that you are going to call validate method of your validator in your code yourself. So again, this one might have an advantage to give you an opportunity to call this validator method at the location you want. Okay, so in this case, if you want to call a validate method after you got the control, this is after data binding happens. Okay, so when the data binding happens and type conversion all happens, you still want to perform some kind of business logic related validation, then this might be a good choice. Okay. Usually if you want to do kind of input form validation, then you want to actually perform it as part of the data binding. Okay, so moving forward, so those are choice one and choice two. And this is global validation. So you have to actually configure. This is XML configuration. And now another validation option you have is what is called valid annotation from GSR 303. So here, basically you can use this add valid annotation on your form object, and then this annotation will force the validation based on annotation in your account class. So if you take a look at the account class, you have, for example, in not null, it cannot be null. The size has to be between 1 to 25. It cannot be null, and things like that. Okay, so in order to force this annotation, JSR 303 annotation based validation, you have to use @valid annotation on that object. Okay. Okay, so let's yeah, so that is basically @valid annotation. So let's do exercise 2 and 3. So here we're going to actually do validation 1. We're going to try the option 1, and validator 2 is trying option 2. So let's take a look at the lab documentation. So we are going to run what is called the MVC form validator project. So in this case, what we want to validate is renewal date. Renewal date cannot be a past tense, past time. So it has to be always a future date. Okay, so today is 2016 September 29th, so it should be after date. If you actually try to renewal date set to past tense, then it will give you an validation error. Renewal date has to be in the future. Okay, so let's actually run that guy. So we have validate the validator here, and run as, and Java. Oh, let's actually stop this guy first, and then run as Java application in application. Okay, so it's deployed. So we're gonna go over here and go to localhost 8080. Okay, so now if I try to enter let's say 2016, yeah, so right now it's set to 2017, but let's try to say 15, and this will result in a validation error. So you should actually see renewal date has to be in the future. Okay. All right, and if you use the future date like 18 and give a name here, and then that should work fine because the validation has been successful. Okay, so if you take a look at the code, we are using init binder annotation, which is used on a method that receive what is called the web data binder object. So this web data binder object is internal Spring MVC object that handles the data binding. So basically we are setting binder validator object. We create a new account. We created account validator object, and we call set validator method, passing that validator object. Okay. So here this is the account validator object, which implements validator interface, and validator interface is again from Spring Framework, and here we implemented validate method. Okay, so first thing we want to do is we want to change the type of target object we want to validate into account object, and here we are just checking whether the renewal date of that account is in fact before the current date and time. Okay, so if it is before, that is an error. So we are going to actually call reject error, and this is the field name that has the validation error, and this is the error code, value renewal date. Okay, so this is basically the this is actually used to extract the information from properties file. So you might actually have a properties file. Let's see, we have a properties file somewhere. Oh, I have to actually search for the properties file. Maybe here. Oh, my message is here. Yeah, so this is the message properties file, and yeah, so value renewal date. So that's where this is coming from. Renewal date has to be in the future. Okay. And if you take a look at the this message properties file, that has to be configured. Let's see, take a look at the in main application. Oh yeah, let me see my configuration. Okay, so we have a two configuration file, and this is where we are configuring the location of message files. Okay, so the message file is located under web-inf my messages, and the primary message file is messages. And you can certainly provide different locale versions. So this is the German versions, and this is the Spanish version. Okay. All right. So that is that. So for your own exercise, create and configure another validator class called myAccountValidator, and add an validation in which the name of the account should start with a passion. Okay. So for example, passion Sang is a valid name, while Sang is not a valid name, meaning the name always has to start with the passion. Okay. So that is for your own exercise. Let's do exercise 3. So this is the case that we are calling a validate method in our handler method. Okay, so this is after data binding and type conversion and other validation in fact happened already, and then you get the control, and then you can call validator method yourself. So again, typically this might be business logic related. Okay, so let's actually run this guy. So in this case, what we want to do is the balance has to be 2000. So this is the case that we are creating a brand new account, right? And we want to make sure the balance is always over 2000. If a user trying to create an account without the proper amount of balance, in this case $2,000, then it will say the balance is too low, it has to be above 2000 or something like that. Okay, so let's run validator 2 project. So let's stop the previous running application and then run the validator 2. Run as and Java application. Okay, it's deployed. So let's go to 8080 and give a name. Now if it is less than $2,000, it will give an error. So balance is too low, it has to be above 2000. So let me actually try 1500, and it should still give us the error condition. Now if I start with a $2,500, then it should succeed. Okay, so let's take a look at the code. So here basically we are injecting validator object. We are using auto-wider notation, which is used to inject an object of this type. Okay, and we basically save it into the instance variable called AccountValidator2. So by the time your code is executed, by the time your create method is being invoked, you should have AccountValidator2 pointing to that validator object. So we can call validator method with account object, and also we are going to use the same result objects. Okay, binding result. All right. So if you take a look at the AccountValidator2 class, again, it's implementing validator interface, and which means we are going to provide validate method implementation. And here, basically, we are checking the balance. Okay, so that's pretty much it. And in terms of Java configuration, as I showed you, this is where we are going to set the message properties, so that the messages properties, so that this error code could be used to extract a correct string message, correct message. For your own exercise is create and configure another validator class called myAccountValidator2. Add a validation in which the name of the account should start with a passion. So same validation logic, but implement using the option number 2, meaning you are going to call the validate method in your handler explicitly. Okay. All right, so one last question. Okay, so I believe validation is actually server side. Any possibility to do in client side itself? Absolutely. You want to actually, let me just forward the question first. In terms of validation, you do client-side as well as server-side validation. As I said before yesterday, we are just dealing with the server-side validation in this particular sample application. But you certainly want to perform client-side validation. So whenever a user, I mean, that is typically done by JavaScript. Okay. And the reason you want to actually do both client-side and server-side validation is the client-side validation will give immediate feedback to a user, without actually going to the server, right? So it will have it will result in a better user experience. However, you still want to perform server-side validation because there could be some hackers who kind of bypass the browser validation. They could actually send HTTP request by using some kind of hacking tool, and in that case browser will not be able to actually perform validation. So for security reason, you still want to perform server-side validation. Does that make sense? All right, so let me